Good evening and welcome. Before I introduce Ellen, I'm going to start out with a commercial message. If you are a member of the Historical Society, we really appreciate it. This helps maintain the house, it helps run our programs, it helps with Town Day. If you are not a member, wow, we'd love to have you join us. There are applications and a pen up on the table just outside this door. Now that's the end of my commercial message. Well, thank you. I am now going to introduce Ellen Knight. Ellen Knight is well known locally as Winchester's archivist and the author of many and various articles on Winchester history published in the Daily Times Chronicle and Stroll Winchester and posted on Winchester History Online. She also is the author of several local history books, including the award-winning Centennial History of Winchester Hospital. Formerly, she was active in town as a concert producer, developing the annual summer concert series and directing the Winchester Concert Series. Prior to this, after receiving her doctorate in musicology, Ellen became a specialist in the history of the arts of the Boston area at the turn of the 20th century, writing a series of journal and encyclopedia articles related to the history of music in Boston. That's her commercial message.
Everyone gets one.
Everyone
Only
gets
one.
a commercial. Only one. Her major work has centered on the life and works of Charles Martin Loeffler, an extraordinary Boston composer and violinist, and a friend of such illustrious people of John Singer Sargent and Isabella Stewart Gardner, and a mysterious figure who composed a sonata captured in wax. She will now introduce our very special guest tonight, Edward Hamlin. Ellen.
Thank you. And I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you, Edward, author of Sonata in Wax. And on behalf of the Society, the audience here, and others who may be watching, congratulate you on your first published novel.
Thank you.
The book has been receiving rave notices.
Ellen, we can't hear you.
Oh,
Could they turn the music?
Yeah, I think the music should be turned off, right?
shall I wait for
I
the
think
music
they turned
to
it
go?
up.
I hope. Well, it's pretty music. I can project a little bit more.
Thank you.
Okay. So the book has been receiving rave reviews. Readers have called it gripping, masterful, worth every moment of your time, captivating, exquisitely written, a real page turner you can't put down, and more. So perhaps we should go straight to the book and start our conversation with a reading.
Okay, we can do that. Before I do that, it's customary and polite to thank your hosts and particularly the venue, the people who provided the venue. And this is a little special because, 20 years ago or so, I think, this house was up against the wrecking ball. It was going to be demolished. And here we are. Thankfully, the concerned citizens of Winchester and their donors pulled together and saved this incredible place. And, for me, of course, has incredible significance because this is where my grandmother grew up. My great-grandparents built it, and we didn't know about it. I only learned about this house in my 50s. I didn't even know it existed. And so to think that the community would come together and raise what I presume was a ton of money to try to, mitigate the asbestos and put in a new roof and new plumbing and everything else that had to be done I could not be more grateful. And so I'm just really thankful for the Winchester Historical Society, their patrons, whoever painted a wall, donated $1, did whatever you had to do to bring this house back. It was incredible. And a few things in the house as you walk around, I grew up with. There's some pieces of furniture around here that you'll see. So when I was a kid, these were actually in our family, and this is pretty much the only thing that came down to us from the Sanborn wealth. They lost all the money, and of course, anybody who's read the book will know something about that. But I'm also grateful that the house provided a place for us to put those Sanborn artifacts and to keep them safe and available to people. I'd also like to thank two individuals before I read. One is Charlie Haverty in the front row here. He's going to be very embarrassed that I'm doing this, but he's a wonderful writer. We sort of were, I hate to say this in this way, but we were pregnant with our first books together. We both published short story collections as a result of winning a prize. We were the co-winners of it. And so Charlie and I go back a ways. And when I had the book mostly written and in manuscript, he read it very carefully and filled, I hear, notebooks worth of notes on it, gave me tremendous input, and the book would not be the same without you. So thank you. And the other person I want to thank, and we will get to the reading, but is, of course, Ellen, who I think we're probably going to hear more about how we met and our relationship, so I won't go into detail other than to say that the book would be a fraction of what it is without her input. She was an amazing source of inspiration, information, photographs that I was able to be inspired by and write from, and so many, many thanks. Yeah. So with that, the book has two timelines that interact. They kind of weave together, and I alternate between them. So there's one story that's set in contemporary time, 2018 in Chicago, and the main character through whose eyes we see the story is Ben Weil. He's a world-renowned classical music producer, on whose desk one day lands 5 of these wax cylinders, which you're welcome to come up and see and touch. And the wax cylinders, of course, contain a mysterious sonata, and that is the core of the book. The other timeline, which occurs just before and during World War I, occurs largely in this house and in this community, and some of it occurs in this room. And so I'm going to read just the very first page of the novel, which is in the contemporary Chicago story, so 2018, through the eyes of Ben Weil. And that's the last we're going to hear from Ben tonight, because here we are, we're going to hear more about Winchester than Chicago. Okay. The book is structured according to the structure of a sonata, or a piece of classical music, so this is a prelude. The music is a fold in time. Given just a few piano notes, the quiet opening phrase, say, hovering like smoke, Ben is transported straight back to the moment of discovery, every detail of time and place intact. The muted undersea lighting of Studio A control booth, where he sat beside Itzhak Perlman and Daniel Barenboim and so many other brilliant players over the years, listening to breathtaking music recorded only moments before. The companionable glow of his meters and indicator lights, the tang of stale coffee from a mug forgotten atop the microphone safe, the smooth glide of the faders under his expert fingers, and the vague sense of Chicago, somehow, roaring about its business just beyond the soundproof walls, the subsonic rumble of buses and the screech of L trains, the air horns trumpeting from the ballpark, the snatches of mariachi and hip-hop and rowdy banter along the sidewalks, the city's soundscape felt rather than heard, a raucous chivalry that never lets up. All this will snap back in an instant whenever Ben hears even the smallest fragment of the lost sonata, blazing through his heart without losing a single watt of its electricity. The piece haunts him like the voice of a missing child. Tender and untouchable, It murmurs in the back of his mind as he wanders home from the studio on rainy evenings, sings to him as he dawdles over his solitary dinners. The unknown pianist churns through darker chords as Ben hurries past the hallway mirror, then listens in bemused silence when he sits down at the piano to unwind with a little jazz. On some mornings, he's jolted awake by the breakneck allegro and springs from bed feeling better than ever, perfectly steady on his feet, almost fully recovered, only to have the music snatch its energy back and his along with it. But as mercurial as the sonata is, he's grateful for its company when the house fills with stillness, when all is a little too quiet in his life. Stop there.
Yeah. I remember reading the prelude for the first time and I was hooked. Now, we first connected in 2019 when you emailed me on someone's recommendation as a local historian with a whole bunch of questions about Winchester, about World War I, women's suffrage, politics, and about the Sanborn family and the house. And we kept corresponding about the facts behind the fiction for about 3 years.
Yeah.
And at the outset, I knew that you were a descendant of the Sanborn family, and I knew you were a writer. I quickly learned, because of course I looked you up, that you are an award-winning writer in the genre of short stories. A group of your short stories were collected into this volume, published in 2015. But this isn't where you began professionally, I don't believe. Your CV has 35 years of experience as an information technology professional.
It's true.
How and when did the fiction writer emerge?
Before that, actually, I started writing fiction in high school, except I will say that my mother recently unearthed a first grade lined paper, piece of paper like you used to learn to write, to learn your cursive or whatever. And on that was a science fiction short story that nowadays we would refer to as a flash fiction, meaning it was under 1,000 words. It's probably under 100 words. And I think it was illustrated also. So I guess I started sooner than that. But I really started writing fiction in high school before I got involved in other things. And one of the reasons that I pursued IT was even then I thought, this is something that I could do. I would have the skill, it's transportable, and I could do my stuff, my fiction writing, and support myself. And that's kind of how it worked out, except it took 35 years to get there. Yeah.
And what was your first fiction publication?
Actually, I had a story published in, I don't even know what year, probably the mid-'80s. Which was a horrible story, published in a small, ephemeral Chicago magazine. And then I published a one-act play, actually was performed in Chicago, and then nothing for years. And I think in 2012, I published a story in a literary magazine, and that was the beginning of sort of, doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have read a number of your stories, not just these. Mm-hmm. But despite a fondness for Nothing to Declare, it's my favorite one, Sonata is far and away my favorite of your works. So the first question about Sonata that I imagine anyone who hasn't read the book would ask would naturally be, what's it about? Mm-hmm. And the answer could be several things. To quote a review, this is a brilliant tale about families and music and talent and legacy and so much more. It's been called a musical mystery, which it is. Mm-hmm. But as that reader stated, it's also a story about family. And importantly, it's a story about character, particularly maintaining one's integrity. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us something about its genesis? The story has some roots in your family, I know, and some in your life in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Could you just tell us how the sonata came about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there were a lot of threads that wove into it. One was classical music, classical piano music, which I love, but I'm not very educated about. Despite having written a whole novel about it, I still feel ignorant. But there was a certain period of classical music from the turn of the century, early years of the 20th century, French piano music, Ravel, Satie, Fauré, these folks that I just spoke to me. And I wanted to learn more about that and really have an excuse to listen to more of that. So that was certainly a really important thread. Another thread is I've been sort of an amateur music recording person for years because I also write guitar music. And so I've always had a home studio, and I've had to learn some skills which are still not very good. And so I was kind of interested in that whole recording studio situation. And because I used to have really bad equipment, like bad microphones, I had to learn about audio restoration because I'd record something and it would sound kind of horrible. And so I had to learn how to go on the computer and tweak it and make it sound good. And that, of course, plays into the story because we have 100-year-old cylinders that are corrupt, have a lot of audio problems. And so I kind of had learned a lot about audio restoration, so I was interested in that. I always wanted to write about the Sanborns because they were kind of flamboyant. I was intrigued by their arc as a family, the sort of, not exactly rags, but, you know, ordinary folks to riches, kind of building a national brand, Chase and Sanborn Coffee, and then squandering it all in the second generation and essentially seeing all the money disappear. And that struck me as such an American arc, you know, such an interesting arc that I really wanted to explore that and learn about it. And then, of course, they're my people, so I wanted to learn more about them. And, you know, somehow all those threads wove together, not all at once and not all in kind of an orderly way, but yeah, those were the seeds.
And of all those family members, your grandmother, Helen,
Mm-hmm.
who's the major one
Mm-hmm.
in the novel, do you feel you've come to know them better, or has your perception of your family changed as you work through the story?
Well, I've learned a lot from you.
I don't know.
I mean, I have. I mean, I certainly visiting this house and working with you, I mean, I have a so much richer and more concrete sense of who they were. I may or may not have memories of my grandmother. I was only 3 when she died. And so I remember sort of some gestalt of her, kind of what her style was or her attitude toward me. I guess she loved me very much. But those could also be imaginary memories. You know, those could be based on photographs that I saw or things that, you know, my mother passed on to me. But anyway, she was the only connection I had to the people that lived in this house. And she did grow up in the house. So that's intriguing. But yeah, I think my understanding of the family is certainly sharper than it used to be. And, you know, if you're here now, Sanborns, I hope I haven't done anything too, you know, horrible to your memories.
Well, I remember wanting you to be fairer to your great-grandmother.
Yes.
In fact, I think I was rather vocal, or, you know,
Yeah.
whether I communicated that originally great-grandma was this snooty, upper crust society woman who
Stern.
basically only associated with the people at her level of society. And I said, no, she grew up on a farm.
Yep.
She didn't go to finishing school.
Mm-hmm.
She would not high-hat somebody who worked for a woman who worked for a living. She fit into society. She was a society leader, but she was a very generous and warm woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she came out okay in the end.
Yeah, but thanks to you. Thanks to you. I mean, sorry to interrupt. I was working mostly off a few photographs of her. There are only a few photographs that survive. And she looks tough.
Oh, there is.
She's scary. I wouldn't want to meet her in a dark alley.
I have to interrupt. There is one, and there's a huge copy of it in the hospital. Rena Sanborn was the chair of the building committee for Winchester Hospital, which was built by a women's organization. And there's a picture of them at the cornerstone laying. They all look like very stern and solemn. And a woman at the hospital saw me looking at the photograph, and she said, "They look like they're at a hanging." And they do.
Well, those were the days when you weren't supposed to smile in a photograph.
No,
right?
well, those expressions were probably, "When are you going to take the picture?" But it was a very momentous occasion for them. But I've always felt a fondness for Rena. She spent her life doing good works.
And that opened up, I mean, your pushback on that opened up subplot stuff for me. Because once I sort of learned from Ellen that she was really a much more generous soul, that opened up possibilities for her in the book that wouldn't have been there before.
Well, so in the book there are factual characters, the Sanborns, and Bell. He shows up at some point, right? And a certain composer we'll get to later. And some of the characters are fiction. Let's talk about the few of the fictional characters. Ben, who's the protagonist of the modern story. He is the one who has the mystery to solve. But he also develops a great dilemma. He doesn't just have this mystery, he's got this dilemma, which is risking his character and his reputation. And at this point, I have to, how many people have read it and how many people, okay, but most people will be reading it, okay.
Don't know, it's a spoiler alert.
Okay, we don't want to say too much and spoil, because it is a mystery.
It's page 105 if you're following in your libretto.
But I don't think it's spoiling anything to say that Ben gets himself into a fix.
Yep.
And it's his own fault. And one of the things I really, really liked about Ben was that he cared about that. He could have just lied and pretended and all, but he was going to make this right. Have you been getting feedback about Ben's character?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that to me is the best part of the story. It's the moral core of the story. It's what is his way out? What is the honorable way to back himself out of this corner he's backed himself into? I don't think my mechanics are quite right there. But anyway, how is he going to solve this in a way that's honorable and ethical and right? And I didn't know the answer. I mean, to anyone who's read the book, like maybe you thought I knew the answer. I didn't. I didn't know how he was going to get out of it. And I just spent a lot of time getting him deeper into it, you know, trying to really turn the screws on him pretty severely. But to me, that, you know, when that event on page 105 happened, that's when the book I knew what the book was about. That's a simple way to say it. And it could have been a really nice story and everything without that, but that was where the book, I think, took a really deeper turn. And so, yeah, I've had a lot of people respond to that, and I think be surprised usually by how Ben gets out of his quandary, which I'm always happy to hear.
Yeah. I'm obviously a fan of the book, but as these two stories go along. They're intertwined stories, and when they come together in the end, that's just stunning. I mean, the people who say that it's a page turner. I read it for the 6th time after it was finally published, and I will confess in the beginning I was thinking, come on, let's move this along, Will. I didn't necessarily want to read about his getting into hot water again, but I wanted him to, the part where he and his friends start getting him on the road to setting things straight. That's the page turner part for me, and I was just entranced with this thing all over again. But when I first started reading drafts, you asked me just to fact check the little sections that were set in Winchester. Did he get it right? And then I asked, well, could I read a little more? And eventually you sent me more of the historical story. So I came away thinking that Elizabeth was the main character, but she's important. She is the protagonist of the historical story. Where did she come from in your imagination?
I don't know. She's a 24-year-old French woman who is a sort of modern soul. Educated, cultured. She's been in the United States for half of her life. She came when she was 12 with her parents. And she's our eyes in which we see and experience the Sanborn family. She's trained as a social worker. She's a graduate of Simmons College. She would like to go on and do her master's degree, but because of some things that happened with her family, she has to go to work. And so she goes to work for the Bell Company, Alexander Graham Bell, who has invented the graphophone, which is the device that plays these wax cylinders. And her particular assignment is not to sell the mass market common graphophone, which there are, hoofers that are out there knocking on doors doing. Her assignment is to sell the high-end imperial graphophone to the wealthy, to the Boston Brahmins. And that's how she meets the Sanborns. So I can't say a whole lot about her without spoilers. But she's our window into the world of the Sanborns, and she's, I don't know where she came from other than my brain. I don't know.
Well, another prominent character from the modern story is Ana Clara Mata. And we were earlier talking about Ana Clara, and you told me that someone knew exactly where from whom she derived.
Yep.
She's, I don't know, if we can't, I can't say too much without spoiling the story. But there is can we call her a villainess? She's extremely talented. She's a pianist, extremely world-class talent, very full of herself, imperious, selfish. It'll be interesting for those of you who haven't read the novel yet to find out what Ana Clara gets up to. At one point, Edward emailed me and said, "Did I lay it on too thick?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." We've touched on the relationship of fact and fiction in a historical novel. To quote another one of your reader reviews, the comment was, "well researched." We exchanged a number of emails about facts behind the 1917 story. But you had more history than just Winchester and the Sanborn House research, like the graphophone factory and more. What are the challenges of writing historical fiction?
It was challenging for me because I'd never done it. That's the first thing to be said. I mean, I'd never in my life in a short story in any format written historical fiction. So that was really fun because I love to research, but really new. And so there's the kind of getting it right part, and that came down to things like dialect and, you know, how people spoke in 1918, what slang they used, what expressions they used. Did they swear? How did they swear? Did they swear within the family? What would happen if, you know, their 18-year-old debutante daughter did things she shouldn't have? How would the parents have addressed that? And then because there's a French element to the story also, because Elizabeth, my main point of view character, is French, and her father is a pianist and, you know, goes back a long way. I also had to figure out, okay, how did French people speak in 1918? What was the dialect? What were the colloquialisms? I didn't want to get that wrong either. And so thankfully, my wife Paula is studying French and had 2 teachers, both of whom are French. And so I had a resource there, but it turned out that one of those teachers' mother is a professor of French literature from the World War I era. Another one of these serendipitous, crazy things. So I was actually able to vet, you know, my French, there was some French in the book, with those folks. So that kind of research was fun, but also scary, you know, getting things wrong. And it was very helpful to have you there.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, of course, some things are set in historical settings, but you turn them into fiction.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you're going to give us another reading. And which one reading is next?
Hmm?
Oh, okay. Eventually, there will be a reading where I was rather amazed, but the next reading is going to be about Elizabeth's first visit to the house.
Yes. And these are, I'm going to do 2 more, and I'll tell you because I go to a lot of readings, and when people say, I'm going to read for 20 minutes, I think, oh, no, you're not. Please don't do that. Please don't do that to me. So these are pretty short. Not short, but pretty short. So this one is Elizabeth's first encounter with this house and with 2 of the residents of this house. And so I know everybody here is a local, so you might have been in the house before, you might have been here for, you know, the holiday gala, I don't know. But if you've walked around the house a bit, you may follow her footsteps and recognize some of this. So this house was called by the family Aigremont as part of their kind of arriviste, you know, kind of nouveau riche desire to build pedigree, so they had to name their house with a French name. So that's the title of this chapter. The art of calling on the well-heeled. Oh, I need to give you a little background, I'm sorry. We have Elizabeth, and then she's come here for a garden party that turns out to be a women's suffrage fundraiser out on the lawn. It's a hot summer day, and she's traveled from the Bell Company headquarters down in Bantry Way in Boston on the harbor to here on the train. She's been picked up in the Sanborn Silver Cloud by their chauffeur and brought to the house here. And she's traveling behind her in a Tin Lizzie is Tom Shea, who is her co-worker. And so she's the elegant saleswoman, he's the muscle. He's lugging crates with the graphophones and everything, you know. So that's who he is. And this is August 1915. Okay. The art of calling on the well-heeled, according to Tom Shea, is to convince them that you're almost as high class as they are. Not quite their set, but one rung down. You want to seem vaguely familiar, like a second cousin they met as a child but can't quite place. Or, in the case of a lovely young woman with a French accent and European manners, the sort of cousin you wish you had. You're the plucky Gibson girl who's always up on the latest fashions and eager to share her modern discoveries, be they tea bags, zippers, dirigible rides, radium beauty creams, or imperial graphophones. You're not there to sell them anything, heaven forbid. You've brought along a few curiosities only to spare your hosts the tedium of rummaging in shops. It's Tom you need to talk to if you want an imperial graphophone for yourself. Elizabeth rehearses the spiel in her mind during the ride through Winchester, whose grand houses size her up coolly from behind their vast lawns. Eventually, the silver ghost turns into High Street, and there it is, abruptly, the Sanborn place spread across a gentle hill, opening its blonde stucco arms to receive her. As the driver glides up to the imposing entrance, a gardener touching his hat as they pass, Elizabeth nervously takes in the arched windows, the Greek columns, the snug-fitting gardens and sun-washed portico, wishing her corset would allow her to take a deeper breath. When they pull to a stop, she touches her mother's locket for good luck. The driver hands her down off the running board and escorts her up the wide steps, then rings the bell on her behalf, crows squabbling in the roomy sycamores down the hill. Before the door, there's a pool of welcome shade. Elizabeth dwells in it for a blessed moment while waiting for the bell to be answered. It's cooler in Winchester than in Boston. This, too, must be something the wealthy can arrange. By the time the door swings open to reveal a maid in a pleated cap, her heart's finding a quieter tempo. Miss Garner, the girl says with a genuine smile, friendlier than any French maid would dare to be. Welcome. The door opens wider. From the corner of her eye, Elizabeth notices Tom Shea being directed to the service entrance, lugging the crates with difficulty, sweat rings under his arms. In winter, he moonlights as an ice cutter on the Charles, hewing and hauling blocks far heavier than the crates, but in high summer, it's a trial. Lifting the hem of her skirt from her boot, Elizabeth hands her parasol to the maid and steps into Egremont, the Sanborn's world opening before her. The foyer, here, is grand, though somewhat less grand than she expected. The maid excuses herself to announce her arrival, leaving Elizabeth to take in the house. And you're welcome to turn around for this part if you need to. To the left is a curving staircase, its pediment trimmed with dark parquet. The floors are polished to a high shine, the walls papered with golden fleur-de-lis. Beneath her feet lies a Persian rug as thick as any rug she's ever stood upon. She looks up. Adorning the underside of the staircase is an ornate floral design in raised plaster. Above the landing, blooming with scarlet and green in the sun, is a stained-glassed window with a garden scene. In her grandparents' day, it would all have been considered quite chic, she's sure. Through the double doors to her right, Elizabeth hears the commotion of servants readying the house for the afternoon's festivities. Now we're in that room. This is fun for me. But where are the Sanborns? As the wait drags on, she wonders whether Rena Sanborn will make a grand entrance down the staircase. Maybe Orrin will come bursting through the parlor doors, peeling off his driving gloves. No, she tells herself, not for me. She's only a saleswoman. They'll know it, even if their guests do not. Though the friendship between the elder Sanborn and Belle should count for something, Elizabeth doubts it will spare her from making a fool of herself. She prepares herself as her mother would have done, adjusts her hat, checks her posture, smooths her blouse. She'd like to powder her neck, but there's nowhere to do it. She tries to make her peace with the uncertainty of the moment, readying herself for whatever manner of greeting the Sanborns might offer. Miss Garner, a woman's confident voice finally from close behind her. Has my mother kept you stranded here like a refugee? Gosh, I certainly hope not. Elizabeth feels a touch on her arm and turns to find herself face to face with a woman no older than herself. Younger, in fact, 20 at most. This can only be the Sanborn's daughter, Helen. It's impossible not to be struck by the girl's broad patrician face, something at once feminine and mannish about it, and by her wide, confident smile. Her orderly white teeth are a wonder to behold, her throat substantial and lovely. It's a moment before Elizabeth realizes the girl's in riding clothes, tan breeches and boots and a green velvet jacket. "You are Miss Garner, aren't you?" Helen says, thumb hooked in her waistband. Elizabeth never guessed she'd be met by the daughter. At this moment, it's a blessing. When Helen holds out her hand, she nods and takes it gladly, surprised by the firm handshake that follows. The girl is so at ease in her world. "I'm grateful for the invitation, Miss Sanborn." The girl tilts her head inquisitively. A chestnut curl escapes her hairband. "Is that a French accent I hear, Miss Garner?" "You've a good ear." "So it would be Garnier, then?" Elizabeth smiles. "It was actually Garnier back home. My parents got tired of being called Garnier, so they changed it to Garner." Something catches the girl's eye over Elizabeth's shoulder. She winks at someone and turns back to her guest with a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "But what should I call you, Miss Garnier, Garner, Garnier?" "How about Elizabeth?" Helen takes her hands eagerly. "That's my middle name. What a grand coincidence." "Mais oui," Elizabeth says, feigning astonishment. "It's only this and nothing more, a coincidence. But if Miss Sanborn finds it grand, so be it. Perhaps it will sell a graphophone or two." There are servants everywhere, and freshly forced lilies, and enormous silver bowls of fruit, and purple bunting hung against the dark wood in graceful sashes. Everywhere Elizabeth looks, the house is exquisite. But in the parlor, they come upon an old woman in a severe black dress. "Now, Mr. Hiscox," the woman snaps at a boyish server. "Step to it." "Mrs. Dooley," Helen says under her breath, squeezing Elizabeth's hand. "Don't cross her. You've been duly warned." The tour is undertaken at lightning speed. The cozy parlor with its marble fireplace, which gives up a faint scent of wood smoke. The double doors fitted with cinched curtains, which Helen throws open with a stagey flourish. The paneled study with its huge explorer's globe and roll-top desk and ugly electric chandelier, a man's retreat if ever there were one. On the sideboard, Elizabeth notes a collection of crystal decanters, an enameled cigar box, a telephone. Nearby sits a Bell dictaphone into which Orrin Sanborn is said to be recording his memoirs. On the wall hangs a buck's head with shellacked antlers, glassy stare fixed on a pair of stuffed trout screwed to the opposite wall. Elizabeth and Helen are alone in the room. With a mischievous smile, the girl rolls back the lid of the desk to expose a jumble of papers, dozens of slips and scraps and crumpled bills, a stunning pocket of disarray in the midst of such immaculate housekeeping. "Father," she says with a roll of her hazel eyes, and closes it again, tugging Elizabeth toward the next room. "And now for the best part," she says, stepping back to sweep her arms toward the gold-coffered ceiling of a music room, the place where the magic happens. It's a lovely room. 3 French doors overlook a garden of cream roses, each door crowned with a crescent window through which sunlight is streaming. The parquet floor sparkles like a mountain brook. Along the walls stand high-backed chairs painted white and meticulously filigreed. But it's another furnishing that stops Elizabeth in her tracks. In the corner sits a snowy white grand piano. Helen lays a hand along its flank as if calming a stallion. Stop there.
And later you're going to have another reading set in the house. It's going to be quite different.
Yes.
Dare I ask if there is a challenge allowing an historian to read your drafts?
Yes, but I think the benefits greatly outweighed the fear factor there. I had a couple of readers do sort of credibility checks, and you and I had a very, I think, polite and productive correspondence over 3 years, where Ellen would write me an email and address me as Dear Fiction, and would assign it and would sign it fact, or was it history?
I think it started off being historian and then
History.
got changed into fact.
Fact.
History, that's right. It was fiction
Yeah,
and
yeah.
history, then fiction and fact.
Yes. So she's fact, I'm fiction. And, you know, not never the twain shall meet. We met in the middle quite a lot. But yeah, so she was a wonderful corrective for a lot of things. And I will say that this is kind of, I'm not going to spoil the last reading, but there is a period in the book where I needed a lot of details about the layout of the house, the floor plan. I was projecting a situation onto the house that it never lived through, which we'll find out when I do the last reading. And so Ellen came here at the height of COVID, alone in this deserted, scary house, and took tons of photos for me, answering all my questions. And we together, I think, came up with some ideas about how to map the events in the novel onto the actual house. So, I mean, having a historian on your team was amazing for that. Yeah, not scary at all.
Oh, I remember that day. It was not scary, but it's a little noisy in this house when it's empty and and the wind's blowing outside. No, I enjoyed it. It was a treat. I have helped other writers from something as simple as they're wanting a photograph to finding sources for them, finding a biographical background. In fact, during the pandemic shutdown year of 2020, I heard from 6 writers. I guess it was time for people to settle down and write that book that they were all putting off for so long. This was my favorite one. No, but they were all interesting in their own way. There was a biographer and a genealogist and 2 World War II buffs. I heard from somebody in Poland, somebody in England, and somebody in Switzerland. That was a time for people to write. Yeah. And why are these people interested in Winchester? Oh, Winchester's just an interesting place to live, and it's got all this history. Okay. This may be out of order, but I wrote down another quote from one of your readers who said, the book is also a deeply intelligent book, and that's true. It's just a pleasure, the meeting of the minds in this book. It can be difficult being an historian and reading historic fiction when the author doesn't get it right. Someone once wrote a book set in 1900 and had the young ladies sniveling into Kleenex.
Yeah.
And he wrote about buildings that were long gone.
Yeah.
And because of these things, the whole book was marred. I just couldn't credit anything that he said because he didn't get his details right. Now, some of your details, really, I mean, you changed things around.
Squishy, yeah.
But you changed things for the sake of the story.
Yeah.
You moved the carriage house.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I understand why.
Yeah.
But at least you didn't have the young Irish maidens sniveling into Kleenex. I will have some things to say about the next reading, but I would like to talk about the title character, the Sonata. First, we can point out that we are in the very room where the Mystery Sonata was recorded on the wax cylinders. This was the Sanborns' music room. They had a baby grand piano and an upright piano, and they had musical programs, including these extravagant modern aesthetic dance spectacles outside, staged by Mary Kellogg, who is now a character in the book. And they had benefit concerts, including one organized by Helen in 1918 for the Red Cross, at which Arthur Fiedler played the piano. But to the sonata itself, one of your readers wrote, "Don't feel like this book isn't for you if you don't know classical music. The origins of a mystery sonata, as well as the lives of the characters, pull you along until the last page." Well, this is true. But as a classical musical lover, I was entranced by the descriptions of the music. And I once asked you, "Can you hear the sonata?" And you said something like, "Well, maybe parts of it." The sonata is pure fiction. But the book reads as though it were an actual piece of music.
Good.
How did the sonata take shape in your mind?
That was pretty early, actually. I mean, the sonata has several distinct movements and several distinct parts in it. And part of the mystery is it's way ahead of its time musically. So we kind of know that it was recorded no later than 1918, probably earlier. So it was composed, you know, turn century, early years of the 20th century. But some of the harmonic ideas and some of the other ideas in it really belong to sort of 1950s. So how could that be? That's the mystery. That's part of the mystery. And so I, you know, kind of had to conceive of a single piece of music that had a lot of periods of music embedded in it. And Anna Clara Mata, the villainess, as you call her, though I wouldn't go quite that far, Ben's antagonist, let's say.
Antagonist.
Yes. She has her own theory of the piece. She's a concert pianist. She knows the repertoire. She's known for her interpretations of the music of this era. And so she's developed her own theory of what it is. And I think she's probably right. It's sort of an homage to the piano music of the 20th century. And it doesn't stop at the early years of the century. It also foresees developments that the composer really would never have known were coming, but had the foresight to imagine and to explore. And so I was able to weave in, I mean, I love jazz. I was able to weave in jazz elements. There's a folk song in the sonata. The origin of the folk song is part of the mystery. And there is some dissonant music in the sonata. So there's some sort of, you know, 1920s pushing ahead a little bit. So it's a pastiche, but that's the concept of it too.
Mm-hmm. Now, another reader said, "I literally experienced the movie version, let's hope, in my head while I was reading. But if there were a movie version, the sonata would have to become an audible piece
That's
of
right.
music." Do you think that's possible?
You know, yeah. That would be fun, because whoever was pulled on as the music director for that movie would have to solve that problem, right?
Yeah. Okay, and from another reader, "If you love music, no matter the genre, you will love how some passages transcend words to evoke that feeling we all get when we really connect with a piece of music." And I've told you, and I'll say it again, my favorite parts were Ben alone with the music. That, I mean, all of us, I think, everyone has a relationship with music, and they may vary in intensity, but there are times they're just like this. In Ben's case, it was a really intimate and even possessive relationship, and of course, the music was extraordinarily important for Elizabeth, but we can't talk about that. And the sonata is at the heart of the mystery, so we can't say too much about it. But I have to thank you for putting Charles Martin into the story. You say you didn't know that much about classical music.
Mm-mm.
And you just decided to have your mystery, your backstory include French characters. And so unwittingly, you got it nailed, because this backstory is set in the 19-teens. The war is developing in Europe, and in the 19th century and the early 20th century, music in Boston was considered musically an outpost of German culture. And not necessarily an opera. There was Italian and French opera, but in concert music, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, these were the staple composers. But then Charles Martin Loeffler comes along, and he starts introducing, he was a brilliant violinist as well as a member of the Boston Symphony, and became a composer. He introduced music by Lalo, by Saint-Saëns, music Bostonians had never heard before. And he was with the orchestra until 1903 when he retired, but he still did informal work for the orchestra. He went to Europe and he introduced interviewed potential conductors on behalf of the orchestra, things like this. So, and when he was in Boston, he was the go-to person for French musicians coming over, looking for positions or jobs, or maybe they want to join this symphony, whatever. He knew nothing about this. The person he contacted at the Winchester archives to learn about Winchester history happened also to be a specialist in the music of Boston at the turn of the 20th century, going up to the First World War. I wrote the book. This is the first and only biography of this man. And so he put Charles Martin Loeffler into the book, and it just fits. It adds verisimilitude to your fictional story about your fictional musical people, your mysterious fictional musical people. And I just think that's wonderful. And he made him so charming. You've read the book, isn't he charming?
And handsome, I think, too, right? Well, he was in this room when the sonata was recorded. Well, the fictional sonata.
The fictional.
Yeah. So.
That's fiction. I don't know that he ever came to Winchester.
No, I mean, in the story.
In the story. In the story. In the story. Yes.
So you're being
too
much fact here.
But it is fact that one of Mrs. Sanborn's nieces was a student of his.
I didn't know that.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'm still learning stuff from him.
There was one part in the book I was kind of frustrated. There's a concert. You've learned that already. There was a concert here with the white piano, and the mystery began with that concert. I would have loved to have. He put Mary Kellogg there. I'd written about Mary Kellogg. He read Mary Kellogg, and she was a very close friend of Mrs. Rena Sanborn. I would have loved to have had a whole segment here on how musically sophisticated Winchester was, and put some more of the musicians in. I can see why you didn't. You had to cut it. The book was already too long.
Yes.
But Winchester really does have a very interesting musical history. So it's very fitting. The concert, the whole mystery originating here, all very fitting. The connection to Loeffler, wonderful, marvelous. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, you're going to give us a final reading?
Yeah.
Oh, and while you're looking that up, I will just mention something I learned from this, and that is that everything can be grist to the novelist's mill. Yeah. I once told Edward a true story about how I helped somebody solve a musical genealogical mystery. In fact, I sent him the story. And I told him about getting this box and it's not the same, but elements from that story,
Yeah.
they're in there.
Yeah, I'll steal from anybody. So there are broadly two stages in the Sanborn house's life that are represented in the book. One you've heard, this is when they're having grand garden parties and everything is beautiful. And then a few years later, 3 years later, it's the influenza epidemic. Boom. And there was also tuberculosis floating around and typhoid and lots of other pleasant things. And so this is where I veer from the actual history of the house to say that Rena Sanborn, who, as Ellen has pointed out, was a founding member of the Winchester Hospital, is approached by the hospital to say, we don't have enough space, we don't have enough beds for these influenza patients. We need overflow, we need an infirmary. And she steps up to the plate and she says, I've got a big house, we'll open an infirmary here. And so she kind of, sends all the family off somewhere else. Helen, her daughter, is already off in New York in the midst of a disastrous marriage, but that's a story for another, you'll read about that. And the boys are sent up to Maine, where the patriarch, the great-grandfather, had a horse farm. And so Helen converts this house into an influenza ward, and there are a lot of soldiers from Camp Devens who have just come back from the front with influenza, because it came from over there. And there are also soldiers who are in boot camp at Camp Devens who catch it before they even get shipped out. And so there's a whole part of the house that's reserved for soldiers. And then there are prominent Winchester citizens who come through here, and so on. So Elizabeth, because of some setbacks in her life, decides that she's going to dive into this and become a nurse assistant, working for Rena and the doctors in this house. And so she is just a practical nurse, really, working with all of these people. And you can imagine this sort of contagion floating around here, right? This is 1918. So there's some things we knew, and there's some things we didn't know about infection. So I'm going to read you just a shorter section from that. And this is actually the very first place, this is the only spoiler really, but this is the first place where the reader will experience the house in this phase with the influenza infirmary. The chapter is called Service. The music echoes up the marble staircase at odd hours. Mostly, though, it arrives after 9 in the evening, when the night nurses are making the rounds to sponge down the feverish, and the day crew have collapsed into their sagging cots. The servants' attic quarters are allocated to the nurses and cooks. The orderlies and mortuary men are squeezed into the music room, here, like submariners, each with no more than a few feet of space for himself. Not that the tight quarters matter. They're asleep almost as soon as they lie down, the way shot soldiers are sometimes dead by the time they hit the ground. The piano music makes its way up the hill from the carriage house along the meandering driveway until it reaches Agremont's French windows, left open to dispel the reek and to bathe the stricken with autumnal coolness. Drifting over the cots in the ballroom and study, it enters the foyer where it regroups and climbs the wide staircase toward the family bedrooms, deserted now but for Mrs. Sanborn in the master bedroom and Elizabeth in little Caleb's room. One never knows what sort of music will come. The whims of the unseen musician are changeable. Sometimes it's a casual arrangement of After You've Gone or I'm Always Chasing Rainbows. Sometimes a bit of jumpy ragtime, once even Für Elise, the unseen player's taste Catholic, his touch fluid and easy, his skills rusty from the war but far from forgotten. It really doesn't matter what he plays. The music lulls Elizabeth to sleep, calming her nerves when nothing else can. The sound of the grand piano itself, its stately and full-throated timbre, consoles her. It takes her home, if only in her heart. She can't get enough of it. If she can't have her father, at least she can have this. On nights when she's fallen asleep to the sound of the distant playing, she awakes without fail the instant it stops. The abrupt silence, another loss, another failure she can't abide. She'd have preferred to bunk with the nurses, but Rena Sanborn insists that she sleep on the second floor. She's all but family now, the mistress of Egremont says, though Elizabeth suspects that with Orrin banned from the house, the boys shipped off to Maine, and Helen marooned in New York, pregnant by a husband who's already left her, spoiler, sorry, Rena Sanborn just wants someone down the hallway at night. Whatever the case, Elizabeth's come to love little Caleb's room, its cozy scale, its boyish charms. It's a perfect refuge from the frights of the first floor. Though Rena's gently prodded her to move into Helen's room, one more suited to a young woman's style of life, she won't hear of it. She's happier in Caleb's world. The invisible pianist is one of the three doctors. He must be. They're the only ones allowed into the carriage house, where they sleep on roll-away beds and play cowboy pool on Orrin's slate table while drinking his whiskey, or so the rumor goes. The quarters are unimaginably luxurious, no doubt, compared to the field hospital behind the Belleau Wood line, where they worked side by side in the blood and muck until a German mortar sent them all home, shrapnel lodged in their hips and legs. Were it not for the influenza, they'd be convalescing quietly in some Red Cross hospital in Ohio or South Carolina or Texas. Instead, they've been shot from the heat of one battle into the slower burn of another. All three have limps. Anyone can see they're in pain, but they don't let it slow them down. They work long days with irregular hours, crossing paths at the carriage house only when their shifts happen to line up. Mostly they sleep when they're together, despite what the rumors say. This Elizabeth will learn in time. For now, their movements are a bit of a mystery. The little carriage house at the foot of the driveway off limits to everyone but the three men and the Italian housekeeper who's been Mrs. Sanborn's most trusted servant since the passing of the formidable Mrs. Dooley. For some days now, Elizabeth has been convinced that the nocturnal pianist is Captain Charlie Westerlake, the only one of them who's a full medical doctor rather than just a medic. She can picture him perfectly tonight as she lies in Caleb Sanborn's narrow bed, listening to the far-off music, the boys' little wooden oxen team and painted roosters and scale model racing sloop arrayed on the dresser before her in the moonlight, her linen mask and nurse assistant's cap folded neatly beside them. She keeps her hairpins and badge in the petite silver loving cup the boy seems to have won in an equestrian competition. Elizabeth watches the little urn catch the moonlight as the pianist plays on, her eyes half closed, the collar of her nightshirt undone. She's lying still enough to feel the pulse in her long neck, the soft and lyric beat of life. She closes her eyes and imagines Captain Westerlake at the keyboard of the grand piano. It's the white Mason and Hamlin that Mrs. Sanborn had moved from the music room to make way for the men's sleeping quarters. The piano on which Elizabeth's own father played his final recital a few weeks before sailing for France. Hard to see how the servants wedged it into the carriage house with the billiard table and other furnishings, but somehow the feat was managed. Now she imagines Westerlake will be sitting on the white bench with eyes closed, slipping gratefully into an unassuming little waltz, like a bone-tired soldier slipping into a hot bath he had no reason to expect. Perhaps his colleagues are listening from their beds. More likely, they're with patients or in the town, the pianist alone for the time being. Westerlake is a tall and quietly imposing man, stocky but not overly so, a man who could wear full whiskers to handsome effect, but chooses to go clean-shaven. His wide-set gray eyes are almost transparent in low light. When he visits one of the soldiers, he drops into a crouch beside the cot, coming right down to the man's level. Elizabeth has observed it time and time again. She's never known a doctor to do this, much less with patients dying of contagion. Though he wears the obligatory mask, he is unafraid, which gives her some idea of just how bad things must have been in France.
Okay. I'm going to make one final remark about fact and fiction. When I read that, of course, the Sanborn House was never an infirmary. And in fact, Winchester got off more lightly than a lot of other towns during the influenza epidemic. And at first I wasn't sure, you know, as an historian, was this really okay? But most of the patients come in from elsewhere. Fort Evans, did they come? Mm-hmm. And we've talked about fact and fiction, and the important question for you is it possible, probable,
Mm-hmm.
plausible,
yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you know, this could have been an infirmary. Well, much to my surprise, a couple of years after reading that for the first time, I was reading an annual report from the Board of Health, and some anonymous woman made that exact proposition to them.
Huh.
She was willing to open her home for extra influenza patients.
Wow.
And I could not find out who it was. I went back to the minutes of the meeting, and that wasn't there.
Well, let's
but
pretend it was Rena Sanborn. Credit where credit is due.
it could have been Rena. I think one of the things that was said was something about it's being accessible. And, you know, there's plenty of space around here that if they needed ambulances and whatever. So, you know, the fiction may not be stranger than truth after all.
So there.
So there. Well, we've been talking all this long time. Are there questions from the audience? Or comments? Yes.
I'll just make a couple of comments if I could. I had the pleasure of reading the book this past summer, and been associated with Winchester since 1950. It was not only great trying to figure out the mystery, but to every once in a while come across a little mention of something that clicked with me. The two lakes down the street where they took a walk, the Calumet Club, which we had over on Dick Street, the carriage house, and as Ellen said, I turned to my wife and I said, I don't think it was ever, I think it's always been here. But I have a different love for this house than most people. And I have told Tom Savini that I probably spent more time in this house than most people in Winchester. From 1954 until 1962, I was the official altar boy for the good nuns.
Who lived here? Wow.
And I lived down on Glen Road, and little Jackie Keene used to take his cassock and surplice and walk up the hill. And I did all of the Holy Week. There were 3 funerals that were held in this room.
Wow.
For 3 of the nuns that had passed away during that time period. So I thoroughly enjoyed it, and
Thank
brought
you.
back some great memories for me.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. Bravo. Yeah.
Having heard you read, I think everyone in the room can appreciate the lyricism in your writing.
Thank you.
And the book grabbed me right at the beginning because I had never felt words describe music in such a way that I was feeling it in my body. And I actually was tapping my foot. I found myself tapping my foot, the rhythm. And it continues throughout the book how you capture the effect of music on people. And particularly our fictional main character, protagonist. I was particularly struck on 244 when the Kaddish is being sung.
Yeah.
And the impact of that on Ben, our main character. He felt something collapse within him, a dam of self-control yielding. Suddenly, all his careful vigilance washed away by grief.
Mhm.
And just the impact of Kaddish being, you know, the body, it's just the psychological, everything is brilliant.
Thank you.
Just love it.
And I'll tell you a little story about that story, if I may. So this is a character named Jérôme Assouline, who is an imaginary, world-famous concert pianist. I mean, sort of at the level of Daniel Barenboim, perhaps. And Ben, my main character in the contemporary story, is Jewish, but he has a sort of ambivalent relationship to his Judaism, I think is a fair way to say it. And he's recording Assouline in his studio, and Ben sort of confesses over lunch that his mother is dying, and he doesn't know, you know, how long she's going to live and so forth. His wife is a cellist. She's off in Europe on a tour, but ready to come home in an instant notice if his mother passes away. And so Assouline, who is a generous soul, hears this, and I could say almost a rabbinical soul. He's something very sort of compassionate about him. And so instead of going back in the studio and playing the piece he was supposed to be recording, he plays the Kaddish and the Jewish prayer for the dead. And that breaks open something in Ben about his relationship to his Judaism, but also his relationship to his mother and the situation that he's in. And that whole Assouline thing I wrote, and then I ripped out in the interest of space, because the book was getting longer than I wanted it to be. And my editor read the book, of course, and at a certain point he said, you know, I think you need one more little exploration of Ben's Judaism. And I said, I've got just the man to do it. I'd already written it, you know, I had to modify it. I mean, it took me 2 hours at my, you know, in the patio table to, you know, fix it and make it thread in. But I'm so glad I did, and hearing you say that makes me even more glad that I did. Yeah. Huh. Yes?
Could we all say hello to your mother?
Yes, please do. I should say that. My mother, I think, if the technology is working, should be watching on the live stream. It's not Zoom, she can't speak to us, but she's watching, and she is 98 years young, Mom. She's doing great. She's been to the house twice. And she would have loved to be here now, but it didn't work out for her to do that. But she is, of course, Helen Sanborn's daughter-in-law. And she's the other living link to this house besides me. And the Downs family, of course, who lived here after the Sanborns lost the house. And so she's been an incredible inspiration to me, of course, in every way, but also a wonderful source of history and memories of the family. Because Helen Sanborn was a hell of a good mother-in-law. She was delightful and very helpful. So, would you like to say hello? Mary Hamlin?
Well, just picking up on what someone over there said, maybe this has already happened. If not, I've got some bad news for you. You have just a gorgeous voice and very expressive reading.
Oh, thank you.
You're going to have to do an audio book.
Here we go again. Yeah. No, I have heard that, and thank you for saying that.
Is there one in the...
So, not yet. My agent is working on that. It's harder than ever to get an audiobook deal for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, I mean, we'll see how this does. I think, you know, if the sales are good, then it'll be easier for her to get that. Yeah.
Well, we want your voice, baby.
That's
Hmm.
Well, this was a amazing that was your first novel.
It's actually not my first novel. It's the first novel that saw the light of day. Two different things. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you all
This
for
one over
coming.
here, Ellen?
Yeah.
This one over here?
Oh, yes.
Yes, sorry for couldn't see me. I apologize, I haven't read the book yet, and excuse me if I made notes, but anyway, I wanted to ask you, and I really apologize if I'm wrong, because I flipped through it at the beginning, but I was just wondering, and not to put you on the spot really, why you didn't have a dedication, and if I might have missed it if it's in there, and also usually, like, it seems like, you know, Ellen and a lot of people help with information.
Mhm.
Did you provide, you know, any appreciation?
Yeah.
And, I mean, I just flipped through it, so I was
It's,
wondering why.
it's at the back.
I'm sorry.
It's at the back. There's an
I mean,
acknowledgement section at the
I-
back.
You know,
Yeah.
with the end notes?
No.
So,
there- Yeah, there are two. There's an end note, which is sort of,
page 405.
Because I thought it might give you
yeah, you probably don't want to read that yet. But the acknowledgements, I give you permission to read. Yeah.
And-
It's next to the end note.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
And-
apologize.
yeah.
I totally
No,
read it. I was
no.
just curious.
And the dedication is in there also,
It is
in the
Yeah.
acknowledgement.
Well,
dedicated.
yeah.
It's dedicated to my father.
Page 407.
Okay.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, I just flipped through it,
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
thank you.
Yes, thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Edward,
Thanks for having me.
and thank you everyone for coming this evening. And as I am hearing, Electra Gavoni, who is the president of the Historical Society, is in Denver this evening, and the technology is working great. So
Great,
she's able to
okay.
have it. So, again, thank you very much. Our next program next month is October 23rd, and Fred Lynch is going to be talking about illustrating his genealogy. So he's an illustrator, professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, and he'll be talking about his journey in his book as well. So thank you again. As Edward is going to stick around to sign some books. Please help Jillian out from Bookends so that she's not hauling all the books back to Bookends. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Have a good night.